So the next question is, has the European honeybee had an impact on our Australian native bee pollinators? So there's reason to think it could have, because the European honeybee is it's found in management, so in those white boxes, but it's also escaped and lives in the wild, and we call them feral honeybees. And we know that feral honeybees are really common in a lot of places in Australia. So if you just go out and watch visitors to flowers, honeybees will often be the most common visitor because of the presence of ferals, not because of managed honeybees. So at least at that level, we have reason to think that honeybees are amongst the most common bees in Australia and widespread. It's a bit less true when you get to the hotter tropical places, but in most of Australia, honeybees really do very well. And so if you've got a introduced species doing that well, then it's natural to wonder what it might be doing to native bees. There's at least one study where researchers monitored the population of native bees, brought in European honeybees to see what happened to the natives, and found that the native bees declined in population. So in that particular experiment, it seemed to indicate that the competition from these European honeybees was bad for the native. So that's more evidence that it could be having that kind of effect. But one of the other important things about native bees, about European honeybees, is that they occupy hollows in trees. Those hollows are also useful to some of our native mammals and birds and reptiles, actually. So there's, as well as honeybees competing with native bees, they also actually compete with parrots and possums and gliders for those native hollows. So in terms of their impact on native biodiversity, there's concern actually on the impact on the birds and mammals, as well as the impact on native bees. So, they probably have had that impact, but on the other hand, they're really well established in Australia. They've been here for more than 100 years, and it's pretty hard to wind the clock back. So, but it's a real issue of concern. So my next question is, as householders, landowners, stakeholders in food production and wildlife conservation, what are some things we can all do to help insects that are involved in the pollination of plants? So that's a good practical question. I'll give you a few thoughts here. The first is, if you don't have to, don't use insecticides. Insecticides kill insects. That's what they're supposed to do. If you want to make sure that you're not damaging these insect pollinators, don't use insecticides. That's probably the most simple thing you can do. The next most important thing is to protect and enhance diverse vegetation. So if you're in a rural farming landscape, then we know that a lot of native vegetation has been replaced by farmland vegetation. Farmland vegetation supports some kinds of pollinators and can be important, but the pollinators that we're losing are the ones that depend on the bushland that's been lost. So if you're replanting, a lot of landowners will be replanting for various reasons, because they want the shade of the trees, or they like the look of the trees, or they want the benefits to soil and water and wind movement that trees bring. So if you're going to do those kinds of plantings, you can do those plantings in a way that also support other native animals like pollinators. And that's got a lot to do with not just the trees you put in, but the understory plants that you put in. So enhancing native vegetation is probably the number 2 or even number 1 thing you can do. What's the next thing? I've lost track with the question. What are some of the things we can help to do? What other animals? This is another question. I'm sorry. So those are the 2 things you should do if you want to really help insects in the environment. The next question is, what other animals besides insects assist in the pollination of wild plants? So insects are certainly the most important, and amongst the insects, bees are the most important. The next most important group, other than insects, are the birds. So Australia, in particular, has a really high diversity of honeyeaters that play a role in pollination, and then also some of the lorikeets, like rainbow lorikeets, for example, play a role in pollination. So birds are important pollinators globally, but especially in Australia with honeyeaters. So birds are probably second on that list. Bats, especially in tropical areas, there are bats that visit flowers and play a role in pollination. And then after that, we're getting down to things that are relatively less common. Little possums can play a role in pollination as they, so pygmy possums, for example. I've done research on pygmy possums that visit banksia cones, banksia flowers, and play a role in pollination. And then there's even weird things like little reptiles, geckos, that play a role in pollination. So they're fascinating stories. But if you actually ask who's the most important, then it really is insects are overwhelmingly the most important. Birds next, and everything else is fairly modest. But they're all beautiful animals that we should care about. Next question. The next question is, what impact does the use of pesticides in agricultural production have on wild insect populations in Australia? So, as I said with one of the previous questions, insecticides are designed to kill insects. That's definitely what they do. And actually, some bees are particularly vulnerable to insecticides. They're even more likely to be killed than perhaps the average insect. So we know that insecticides do that. And then some of the other farm chemicals like fungicides, there's concern that they might also increase harm to insects. There's concern that combinations of fungicides and insecticides together can cause harm to insects, although that's less well studied. It's increasingly something that people worry about. So certainly we know that the use of agricultural chemicals is bad for insects. We also know that agriculture as a land management practice encourages a few species to form really large populations. So most species don't do well in agriculture, but those that do well in agriculture do really well. So agriculture itself can make these massive populations that then compete with native insects. So I think the main thing, sorry, one more thing I should say is, of course, if you're a producer and you risk losing a crop because of an insect pest, it's understandable why you might end up having to resort to insecticides. So I think insecticides are a given in agriculture that we'll sometimes have to use them. The challenge is just how to use them smarter and use them less. And I think what we really want to do, as well as using less insecticides on our farmland, we want to really make sure that we don't have spillover effects. So we don't let it drift over into natural vegetation. And if we're creating big pest populations, we don't let those pest populations drift into other parts of the landscape. There's lots of people out there working on different ways of improving agricultural methods, improving practice. So there's many different opportunities to produce things with lower insecticide use. And there's benefits that go beyond just protecting insects, health benefits to humans, for example. So there's lots of good science in this area. We need to try and get that science out into the farming community. And actually, we need to get consumers to understand that sometimes it's more expensive to produce food without insecticides, and so maybe it's going to cost more, for example. But that's an important question. But another point which I made earlier is that we don't actually monitor our insect populations well enough to know on a case-by-case basis what pesticides are doing to our bees, even though we know because of one-off events we can see the harm it does. It's hard to know what the long-term trends are. So the next question is, are there invading exotic insects that outcompete native pollinators in our gardens? That's an interesting one. We know that invasive species are an important problem in biodiversity conservation. So if you look around your garden, you probably find some of the most common visitors in your garden are actually introduced species from other countries. And the examples I use are honeybees. I already talked about. Honeybees come from Europe and North Africa, so they're introduced species in Australia, and they do very well in a garden environment. So they'll probably be your most commonly seen bee. But then also hoverflies. A lot of people confuse hoverflies for bees because they can look so similar. But Google it and you'll find out what a hoverfly is if you don't already know. And some of the most common hoverflies that you find in your garden are also introduced species that are well adapted to gardens and to agricultural environments. So it's certainly true that there are these very common introduced species in our gardens. The harder thing to know is how much they're competing with our native bees, although I did address that question a little bit earlier. There's reason to believe that there's competition going on, and it's a good thing for us to try and do some experiments on, but we don't know enough. So if you want to try and tip the balance a little bit, then you should be growing more native plants. So where native bees have the special advantages with native plants, or to put it the other way, if you're growing introduced plants, many native bees will not forage on those introduced plants because they're less familiar with them. Some bees are kind of open-minded and they'll visit just about anything, but some of our native bees are a little bit more choosy and they're less likely to do well on introduced species. So with a colleague, I did a study last year where we looked at these crops that are grown all around the world. So most crops that we grow in Australia are also grown on every other continent. And so we looked at studies that had surveyed bees on different crops in different places. And you could look at what happens when a crop is grown in its place of origin. So for example, tomatoes in Mexico. That's where, tomatoes come from that part of the world. And when you grow tomatoes in Australia, you're growing it outside of its natural location. And what we find is that when you grow a crop in its home location, it gets more pollinators because you have those adapted local native species. When you grow a crop in a different part of the world, it'll still get visitors, but it gets fewer visitors because not so many of the local species recognise it. So the next question is, if you had one wish to bring assistance to our wild plant and insect species, what would it be and why? So another really practical question. So my one wish, I thought about this and I decided what we need to do is to stop the clearing of bush for the expansion of farming or urban development. And then we need to learn to use the already cleared land better. So I wanted to highlight this because I think a lot of people think that in a country like Australia that we're no longer clearing native vegetation, we're no longer clearing bushland. But it's not true. We're still expanding our farmland and our urban land into native habitats, and that's really unfortunate. And it's not actually necessary. If we focused our resources on making the existing land more productive, we could continue to produce food and fibre and all the things that we do from our farmland. We can continue to do that effectively without further expansion of agriculture. So the number one thing for saving insects is actually the same as the number one thing for just about all other biodiversity, and that is stop clearing native vegetation and replacing it with these more simplified kinds of vegetation like farming or urban land. Of course, farmland, we absolutely need farmland in Australia, and we will continue to need it, but we should do better with what we've got rather than further expanding. Another version of this is when we take a grazing environment that includes native grassland and replace it with a cropping environment. So the native grassland has got some natural values and supports native pollinators. If you replace that with a field of wheat, for example, then you've greatly simplified it and you've really lost something. So changing from grazing to cropping is another form of habitat loss that's really important for us to understand for biodiversity. And part of making the existing farmland better for nature is to make it more of a patchwork. So instead of having massive monocultures everywhere, we should be having a bit more of a patchwork where different kinds of farming are side by side, and then in the mix too we've got little bits of native vegetation. So my vision would be a patchwork. So the last thing is I got a few more questions that are short and sweet questions. The first one is, how do we attract dung beetles without having dung? The short answer is you can't. Dung beetles are one of these kinds of insects that are highly specialised. They need dung. They cannot persist in the environment without dung. They're not going to come to you without dung. So sorry, you can't do it. The next question is, why are ants so strong? I love this question and I don't really know the answer. I think what the question is getting at is strong for its weight, right? So when you see an ant, a tiny, tiny ant carrying something that's almost as big as its body, you think, wow, that's incredibly strong. And in that sense, ants are really strong. And part of the reason is actually not biology so much as physics. There's something about, there's a scaling thing there where small things are relatively strong pound for pound, and really big things like elephants are actually not so strong pound for pound. An elephant could never pick anything up as big as an elephant. So that's sort of a physics thing which I can't even explain for you now. You'll have to Google that one. But there's another part to it which I wanted to mention, which is that ants are social insects, and amongst those social insects have differentiation into different body types because they have different jobs to do. So you have the queen ant, whose main job is to make babies, and then you can have soldier ants whose main job is to fight and guard the nest. And because of that ability to specialize, maybe one reason why some of these ants are so strong is because they can specialize on just doing the job of carrying things. Whereas with humans, basically each human has the same kind of set of challenges in front of it, except I suppose there's the difference between men and women, but basically humans have to be able to do all things at once. Whereas in social insects, you can have these specialized bodies that really do one thing. Maybe that's part of the answer. And the last question I'm going to answer is, what are some of the most interesting insects you've seen? So I wanted to highlight a few different ones here. There are these bees called euglossine bees. I think you probably knew I was going to talk about bees. Anyway, my favourite bees are probably euglossine bees. They visit orchids and they occur in the tropical parts of Central and South America. And what I love about them is when people started working on them, and they could tag a little bee, like putting a paint mark on it, and then they would hold up a flower and see if it visited the flower. And over time they realised these bees could smell the flower from a very long distance. And when they did experiments, they eventually found that these bees can travel 30 kilometres to find their flowers. So people they extracted the perfume, and you could hold up a perfume extract and wait, and eventually you get bees that had picked up that smell from tens of kilometres away. So this sounds almost unbelievable, but it's true. It combines two things which I think are interesting about insects. One is some of them can really move a long way. They've got really strong flight. But the other is that insects are masters at smell. So humans are hopeless at smelling things compared to a lot of animals actually, but especially insects. So these euglossine bees can smell really small amounts of something and smell it from a long way away. Another example of that, which I've addressed in my own research, is a pest insect called the cedar titmoth that attacks Australian red cedar, a tree that we would love to grow if we could, but whenever we grow it, this moth turns up and eats it. So we did an experiment where we grew Australian red cedar trees in what was otherwise a huge plantation of pine trees. And we figured, how could the moth ever find the tree if it's in the middle of a giant pine plantation? But they did, because they have this incredible power to smell the smell of that tree from tens of kilometres away. So we thought that might be a good trick. It didn't work. The moth showed up and laid its eggs, and the caterpillar started eating the tree in the middle of the pine plantation, just like they do everywhere else. Another kind of animal I really love are some mites. So mites are not insects, they're insect relatives. And there are these mites that live in flowers and they feed on nectar and pollen. But because they're so small and they can't fly and they've got tiny little legs, they can move from flower to flower on the same tree. But when that tree stops flowering, they're going to die unless they move to another tree. And it's really hard for them to move to another tree. So unlike the bee and the moth I just described, these are animals that don't move very well. So their trick is they climb on the pollinators that do move. So there are mites that jump onto the bill of hummingbirds, and then they sit there on the hummingbird bill, and when that hummingbird gets to another flower, it hops off again. And there's others that do that with bats, and do it with moths and other flower visitors. So they live on flowers, but they rely on pollinators to move from flower to flower. So I like that idea. I think they're great. And then finally, just a reminder that bees and ants are social insects, or I should say many bees are social, not all bees are social. All ants are social, and then we've got termites that are social insects. And when you think about what they do, where they live in these societies of sometimes thousands or tens of thousands of individuals, and they have these different castes like queens and soldiers and workers and drones and whatever. They're amazing stories to understand the biology of those organisms. And so to me, they're amongst the most fascinating insects, but they're also, it turns out, amongst the most important, because in most environments, if you ask what are the most commonly found insects, it'll often be the social ones that through their social biology are able to really use a lot of different resources and occupy a lot of space and then become really common in the environment. So thanks for those fantastic questions, and I hope you enjoyed listening to some of those thoughts.